One of the hottest topics of these last few months in America has been immigration, and specifically at ground zero, what's been happening in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And wherever you are on this issue, there's no doubt this has divided the country and rippled a powerful conversation all across the nation. And in this episode, for the first time, we're going to tackle this issue in two ways. First, we're going to have a guest who's an on-the-ground person in Minneapolis, a member of the community who's been actively involved in what's been going on, who's going to tell us what it's been like to be there in the community and what it's been like to trying to stand up against some of what's been going on. But second, we're going to talk about the bigger issue, about immigration in America, our struggles with it, what Americans actually feel and believe about immigration, which shows that maybe we're not as divided as we seem to be, and talk about how we can go the way forward with immigration in America, given everything that's happening. You don't want to miss this episode. Let's get started. Hi, I'm Dr. John Izzo, and on behalf of my co-host, Alain Gauthier, I want to welcome you to this episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast, where we tackle the big issues of our time and talk about a constructive way forward for humanity and planet. We're glad you're here. Now, today, we're going to be stepping into one of the most emotionally charged and politically tangled issues in America, immigration. It's a topic that touches our economy, our identity, our history, and our sense of who belongs. And right now, it sits at the center of a deep divide in the United States. Minneapolis has become one of the flashpoints in that national conversation. What's happening there in Minneapolis is more than a headline. It's a window into the deeper questions we're wrestling with as a country. Today, we're going to explore those questions. We're going to try to understand how we got here, what's happening on the ground, and maybe even glimpse a way forward. And my invitation to you is simple. However you come at this issue, try to stay open. Don't retreat into your starting position. We're trying to do the same thing, to listen, to learn, and to hold that complexity. Now, our guest today isn't a policy expert or a political strategist. There's something more important. Someone living and working on the ground in Minneapolis, seeing firsthand how immigration debates shape real lives and real communities. But before we bring them in, I want to start with something more personal. You know, in America, we have a myth that we've always been this amazing, great melting pot, the Statue of Liberty and all that stuff, that immigrants have always been welcomed here and with open arms. But the reality is much darker and sinister than that. My grandparents on my father's side emigrated from Sicily to the United States in the early 1900s. Now, as an Italian American now, I have to tell you, I feel no prejudice about being Italian. Italians are deeply rooted as insiders in American culture, and we're considered, when you check off a box, as white or Caucasian. But it wasn't always that way. When my grandparents immigrated from Italy in the early 1900s, and for most of the 50 years, from 1880 until 1930, when millions of Italians came here, that wasn't the case. They faced incredible prejudice and persecution. Sicilians were called Guineas, as were many Italians, and Guinea was from a West African idea that they were not quite white. They were mostly considered lowlifes and criminals and greaseballs. Because they were Catholic, they were often targeted by organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and even lynched, though most people don't know that. And Italians were often blamed for taking jobs, for changing the culture, and were considered to be people who could never be assimilated. So my grandparents and my descendants experienced much of what many immigrants have experienced throughout American history. And so I wanted to start with that more personal note that this melting pot has always been a bit of a myth. We've always struggled with the outsiders in America. Maybe tribes all over the world have always struggled with it. That's why this conversation is so important. And I want to tell you one more personal story about a conversation I had with a woman from Minnesota in a hot tub in Palm Springs just a few weeks ago. Now, she happened to be in her 70s before you get some image of me flirting with someone in a bikini in a hot tub. The woman's in her late 70s from a rural town in Minnesota. As we started our conversation, she happened to talk about what was happening in Minnesota. It became obvious as we talked that she had voted for Trump. But then she told me three stories that I felt struck at the heart of the human side of immigration and this whole debate. She said, we have a man in our community from Spain who's lived here for almost 30 years, but he never got status. And ICE raided his home and sent him back to Spain, even though he has no family and no friends there. His entire life is here in our little town. And she said, it just isn't right. She said, and there's a young Mexican family that opened up a very popular bakery in our little rural town, and they closed because the rumor is they're afraid that ICE might raid their bakery. And you know what? We really miss that bakery, and I just don't think I like that. And then she said, on the other hand, there were 8 illegal immigrants who were in a prison in our town. There's a prison in our town, and ICE came in and deported them. And she said, I think that's a good thing. They should go. And it just reminded me that she didn't speak in political slogans or tropes. She didn't have a side. She was simply talking about the human story of immigration, much like the story of my Sicilian grandparents who came here to make a new home. So let's get started. Let's bring in our guest, Kathryn Ringham. Welcome. Kathryn, first of all, it's great to have you here.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all those introductions and also for the invitation to join you today in this important topic and discussion. As someone who has lived for many years in what many people call flyover country, Minnesota, we're just not used to sustained attention, but we're eager to share the recent intense experiences and lessons learned. As an elder activist and retired clinical social worker, it was impossible not to be engaged. I lived within 2 miles of the George Floyd murder, the Annunciation Church, and the sites of the death of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. They are all in South Minneapolis, so this is close to my heart. I also live in a neighborhood that has collectively come together for various needs through the years and communicates frequently through a neighborhood alert. And to add some recent history as context, Minneapolis has been through more in the last 6 years than a city should have to bear. As many of you know, we were hit hard by events that have caught national attention. In 2020, we survived the George Floyd murder and ensuing riots. We mourned the assassination of our Speaker of the House, Melissa Hortman, her husband, and even her dog, and the injuries of another senator and his wife. In 2025, we also collectively came together after the mass shootings at the Annunciation Catholic Grade School. We live next door to a family with 3 students who experienced this tragedy on a block with 6 families affected firsthand.
Well, Kathryn, first of all, wow, I feel like that was like Niagara Falls about what Minnesota has been through. And you made such an important point that, Minnesota is hardly in the news, but now in these last number of years have been in the news in some seminal events in America. The death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement that emerged from that, the killing of your legislator, which, really, because so much is happening in America, hardly made the national news for very long, which itself speaks to the tragedy of our times. And now this. Alain, let's dig in a little bit around that experience in Minnesota, especially around this present situation with the immigration.
Yes, Kathryn, you are in Minneapolis every day, as you reminded us. And what are you seeing and hearing that the rest of the country may be missing, even though it's largely reported on the news? What's the emotional temperature on the ground at this time?
Yeah, the emotional temperature is everything all at once, I'd say, for sure. The main, I think, dominating emotion is probably fear, comes from the tactics that ICE is using that we're witnessing. But what happened in Minneapolis over the past 2.5 months did not unfold all at once. It came in little waves of kind of worse. And the bottom line is we feel like ICE does not make us safer. It's making just the opposite happen here. So from a base of 150 ICE agents, the federal government launched the surge, which we now call Metro Siege, sending large numbers of ICE and border patrols, and they were seeking the worst of the worst. State and other leaders warned us that the scale and tactics were going to be extreme, and they were right, as it turns out. And now the ICE is gendering fear, rage, distrust, and a big lack of transparency. They're not limiting their aggression to immigrants with a criminal record. In fact, they're detaining people who have true lawful status. Currently, they've involved the arrest of 4,000 people, but most of the detained have no criminal record. And the lawsuits are really piling up. But this invasion has reshaped how people moved every day, how they went to work, to school, to worship. Even the grocery store has changed. One community leader said people stopped living normally. And this abnormal enforcement practices began right away. People began reporting ICE agents entering their homes, breaking doors to get in, windows, detaining people at work, and positioning themselves near food banks, near stores and apartment buildings.
So, Kathryn, how has it affected you personally? I'm curious. What have you noticed yourself in terms of your own daily life, what it's been like? And maybe if there's a couple of things that you witnessed yourself that really stood out for you.
As a long-term resident and an activist, I certainly was paying a lot of attention because there's so much interconnection between a lot of the issues that are going on. We did go to a protest. It was supposed to be a real quick, short one, and instead it was like 2 miles long on both sides of the street. And when you go to these protests, it's really affirming what your stance is. So that's been very positive. I talked to a few friends who went to the largest protest. There were reported to be 50,000 people there, and the weather was Minnesota's coldest. It was wind chill of minus 29 degrees. The end result was seeing the creativity of all of that was really, really empowering. But it's been surreal. And of course, with children, my daughters live nearby and their 5 grandchildren, you worry a lot about what they're hearing at school, what they're witnessing. My grandchildren are between 12 and 18, and the oldest ones is who I talk to, and they say they are talking about it at school. Their school did not have a walkout. So we talked about that a little bit.
You know, looking at the news, it felt like a city under siege, you know, almost like a war zone. Mm-hmm. Is that how your friends and family said it has felt on the ground? You mentioned businesses being closed, some cases schools. Has it felt kind of like a war zone almost in Minneapolis?
Yes, it has. In fact, the images with the tear gas and all the chemicals that were used right in people's faces, it did appear like a war zone. And some of the images that have come out have been very, very strong. So that's been really, really hard to bear because this is our city that didn't want this to happen. We are a state that really embraces and our immigrants and would like them to thrive. So this has really been a turn of events that goes against the grain for many of us in this state. That's for sure, including me and my family. I have spoken to my grandchildren a few times about their reaction and what they're hearing from their friends. They are reporting that the teachers are talking about it. Their friends have been through school walkouts. And I encouraged them to join me in the protests.
Kathryn, you know, many of the people that have been deported are like that man from Spain, that woman talked to me about in the hot tub. What's the word on the street in Minneapolis about that? But is that kind of in terms of what you're hearing informally, what people are saying is that a lot of people have been taken who don't have criminal records, who are simply being targeted either because they're here illegally or in many cases targeted simply because of their race? What's your impression from hearing from people?
My impression is that there is a lot of fear in the community, and it's really the overriding emotion right now. I think the emotional impact was less about headlines and more about daily life, you know, the hesitation, the disruptions, to see and witness paramilitary agents zipping around the Twin Cities, bending the normal norms of policing, creating terror and confusion. They used, as many of us know, unmarked cars, face coverings, no name tags, just lend it to an increased sense of vulnerability for all of us. In terms of the emotion, Governor Walz and Mayor Frey were angry, as we all know. Governor Walz said at one point, "This is ridiculous. Nobody is fooled into thinking this buffoonery is a reasonable use of taxpayer dollars. It should not take 50 ICE agents to arrest one guy in a library." And hospital staff were very upset when ICE agents came in without warrants. I think the other big emotion was people who went to peaceful protest rallies and vigils put anxiety into action. And residents in the sense of solidarity and determination just grew and grew and grew by day. But I have to say now, even with the recent drawdown that is happening, the fear and mistrust remain very, very high. It appears that they're operating more in the suburbs now, where there is less signal organizing. Many residents feel the threat has not gone away and anxiety continues to shape their daily life.
Well, thank you, first of all, Kathryn, and we'll come back to you in a few minutes and dig a little deeper. But thanks for that on-the-ground feel, and of course, for what you're doing there in Minneapolis. Alain, let's switch for just a few moments to talk about immigration in America more generally. And Alain, you have a perspective yourself because you yourself emigrated to the United States and are, in fact, a green holder. Not a citizen. Maybe talk a little about your experience, and I don't know if you're willing, but you were even talking about even some fears that you have, even now. But over to you for a moment, and then I'm going to kind of paint a picture of what we actually know about what Americans think about all of this.
Thank you, John. Yes, I immigrated to California 40 years ago, and at that time it was such a natural move for me to make. That's where the new things were happening in my work as a consultant, as a midwife of teams. And I definitely would think twice now. And the fact that I am still a green card holder 40 years later, for reasons that are mine, I feel like a French citizen and a very happy resident in this country, is that there is some insecurity that's been generated among immigrants, that if they leave the country and if they only have a resident alien card, they may not be admitted back. And that was my case. I went to Europe a year and a half ago, and I wouldn't go back at this time for fear of being held at the border and saying, no, we don't want you. You've signed up too many petitions, maybe that are not going the right way. And so there is that sense that we're not welcome, even with a resident alien card. And that's something that I feel about it, because this country has been so hospitable to me. And I am in contact with people who have postponed their coming to the States because of that reason.
And, it mirrors a bit of a friend of mine, Paulina, who lives in Wisconsin.
Yes.
And is an immigrant from Russia, but she's been in the United States for some time now. And she was talking about, with all this talk about immigration, suddenly her daughter, who's only like 12 years old, was starting to have people say things like, well, you're a Russian. They're bad people, right? Look what you're doing to the people of Ukraine. And Paulina had a hard time, explaining to her daughter, well, look, we don't live in, Russia, Mom. Why are they blaming me for that? And, it got me to thinking, what do Americans actually think about immigration? And so we've been digging into some of the actual most recent polling, like as of right now in February of 2026. And a couple of interesting things stand out for me. One is there's two big myths about how Americans feel about immigration that isn't true. One myth is that all Democrats want open borders. In fact, only about 3 in 10 Democrats say they pretty much want open borders. Whoever wants to come here should come here. And 79% of Democrats say that they think anyone who is here has broken the law, is a criminal, should be deported. And interestingly, members of both parties and independents all want more border enforcement. So again, it's a myth that independents and Democrats don't want border enforcement and want open borders. Second myth is that all Republicans want everyone deported, when in fact, about 65% of Republicans say that immigration is good for the United States. We should be encouraging it. About 50 to 60% of Republicans say they would prefer a path to status for people who've been here for many years rather than deportation. Now, there's an interesting split, which is about 55% of the Republican Party are now consider themselves MAGA, and that's self-identified. So they ask a person, are you a MAGA Republican or not? And interesting, about 55% of Republicans say they're MAGA Republicans. 45%, meaning 45% of the people who probably voted for Trump, do not consider themselves MAGA Republicans. And there's a big difference, by the way, between those two groups in terms of their feelings about things like deportation. with a large number of those who are non-MAGA Republicans, about half the party, much more favorable to people who've been here for a while to having status. So I just think it's kind of interesting. And one more interesting thing about the situation in Minneapolis, but when the Renee Good shooting happened, about 53% of Americans said it was not justified. When Alex Preddy was shot, it went up to 65%. Among Republicans, 76% said it was justified after the Renee Good shooting, but only 44% after the Alex Preddy shooting. And 2/3 of Republicans felt that the president and the Republican Party were not telling the truth about what's happening in Minneapolis in terms of the shootings. So the interesting thing is that Americans are actually pretty well aligned around we should deport criminals. Americans are pretty well aligned that immigration is still good for America, and well over 60% plus believe that people who've been here for a long time should have a path to status. So I think one of the really interesting things in America is that I feel like the extremes are holding the conversation. So you would think there's only two kind of groups of people in America: people who want open borders and sanctuary cities, and people who want everyone to be deported, when the truth is somewhere much more nuanced than that. And it's like that woman in the hot tub from Minneapolis. And I hope you're enjoying this conversation about immigration in America and about what's happening in Minneapolis as much as we are. And we'll get back to it again in just a moment. I just wanted to thank you for being a part of our podcast community and encourage you to follow us on whatever platform you're on. It helps us and it helps you. First of all, it means you'll always know when a new episode comes out and when we have special events like our Crossroads live conversations so you can join them. And it also helps us because it spreads these great ideas. Second, we'd love you to comment. Comments make such a difference because this isn't a one-way conversation. When you comment on those platforms, it really begins a conversation with our community about these important issues. Finally, we really encourage you to go to our podcast website, wayforwardpodcast.com. And there you'll find all kinds of great resources. And you can even buy us a coffee, which is a simple way of donating to help support this good work, to help keep it going. So we'll get back to the podcast now, but thank you for being a part of our community. Please, again, subscribe, comment, and let us know what you think through our website, and buy us a coffee. We'd love that. Let's get back to the conversation. I guess one of the interesting questions for both of you is, I don't know how we get away from this conversation that we're having right now, because it feels to me like we're never going to break this deadlock until we recognize that the majority of Americans don't want either of what's going on. I'll say one more thing. When Joe Biden opened up the border, Americans didn't want that. When Donald Trump decided to deport people who've been here for years, Americans didn't want that. So one of the fascinating things is we have governments doing things the people don't actually want. And it's just a fascinating sociological experiment. So either one of you, Kathryn, looks like you have something to say.
I wish we could get our arms around this. We're really overdue and things just have been stymied. But yes, I'm aware that you are absolutely right, that there is much more alignment than what we hear about. And I think there's a whole list of demands or wishes that people have for Minnesota, even about just the ICE agents with their militarized approach and the amount of money that they have to spend. One of the things I found out through some of the Signal chats is that they're using ghost cars with license plates that don't match, so they're untraceable. And 60% of the ICE cars here have places where they hide the cars, and also that the license plates don't match. And the other thing that they're putting a heavy use on right now is voice and face recognition through various technical software and apps in their phones, and to the point where some of the observers, when they catch up with them or stopped by ICE agents, are called by their name. There's a big threat among even the observers that in the future, their face and their experiences will pop up in a negative way. I do think that most people do want a path forward that is humane, that makes sense, that's common sense. And I think it's out there. I think it's possible.
You're talking about the tactics of
Mhm.
ICE.
Mhm.
And about now 6 in 10 Americans believe that the Trump administration has been too harsh in its treatment of undocumented immigrants in the US, while only 3 of 10, about 30%, say they're handling it about right. And only 7% say they've been too lenient. But interestingly, again, almost 6 in 10 of voters in America said the Trump administration has deployed ICE agents in Minneapolis more for political reasons than for law enforcement reasons. And I think that's one of the things that has stood out to a lot of reasonable people in the middle is there are 130,000 or something like that, potentially illegal immigrants in Minneapolis. I live in Southern California. I haven't seen an ICE agent in Palm Springs. I wonder why. It's a Republican district. And there probably are a lot of undocumented immigrants here, but I haven't seen an ICE agent anywhere in Palm Springs where I live. And so I think the point is not to make a political statement, but Americans are smelling a rat in all of this, right? And it's getting in the way of a reasonable conversation about where we go from here. Alain, what are some of your thoughts?
Well, there's a parallel with France and Europe. I don't have maybe exact statistics about Europe as a whole, but for instance, in France, there's still 56% of people who have concerns over national identity, security, and integration failures. And this has been, and it's interesting, particularly in France, but I think it happens also in Germany. There is an overlap between saying no to immigrants and saying no to Muslim people. So it's a complicated because of that, and probably a little more emotional because of that, because it touches some of the religious roots. But the French and the European identity issues are very real. That it may not has taken the form, it hasn't taken the form that it takes here in the States, but the situation has certainly been degraded, has worsened in the last few years, especially as more immigrants have come into Europe from various parts of the world. So I would say this notion of identity, is our identity threatened? Is our language threatened? Is our morals threatened? These are things that are very much in people's mind across the Atlantic as well.
Yeah, I want to say a word about that. And I'm curious what it's been like to be in Portland, right? So I talked a little about in Sweet Palm Springs, where not an ICE agent has been seen. I'd love to know about Portland. But, you talked about Europe. And, one of the things for Americans to recognize is that this is an old struggle in America.
It is.
I not only mentioned my Sicilian grandparents, but a lot of Americans don't know that in 1924, the U.S. Congress passed an act called the Johnson-Reid Act. And the Johnson-Reid Act basically shut down immigration in America for almost 4 decades. And basically it targeted immigrants almost completely shut down immigrants from Asia and severely restricted immigrants from Southern Europe, people from Greece, from Italy, from Spain, et cetera. And the reasons cited were the same reasons that we hear today. Things like they're going to take jobs. And in fact, every time there's been a downturn in American history, and it's probably as true in Europe and other parts, immigrants always get blamed for that. And so the Johnson-Reid Act, and there was a fear that America was, like you said about Europe, was becoming culturated by these non-white, non-Northern Europeans, non-Protestant, not even non-Christians, non-Protestants, these Catholics that were invading America. And the interesting thing is to look at the impact of that act. And one of the things that happened was when World War II, the run-up to World War II, when millions of people were trying to flee, especially Jewish people, but many people trying to flee from the persecution from Nazi Germany, one reason America didn't accept many immigrants, besides the anti-Semitic feeling that there was in America at the time, was because of the Johnson-Reid Act. So that when the world needed us most, we weren't there, in part because of the same fears that have driven the kind of thing that you see now. By the way, one more interesting statistic. Then I want to hear about Portland. I missed this one. When you add this condition, people have been here for 10 years, are employed and have a clean record. 60% of Republicans say those people should have a path to status. 60%. 6 out of 10 Republicans, when you add those. So that guy from Spain, 60% of Republicans would say he should stay. And so there is a lot more alignment than we think. And by the way, again, very few Americans, about 30% of Democrats want just to open up the border and let people in, whether here legally or not. That is not the norm. It's not what most people want. In fact, most people, including Democrats, support more enforcement at the border. Just happens Democrats don't support a wall, probably mostly because Trump was in favor of it. Even if a wall made sense, Democrats would be against it because Trump is for it, let's face it. But Alain, tell us what it's been like in Portland.
Well, it's been interesting in Portland. I have been to a few demonstrations myself. I am glad I didn't go to the last one. I tried to, but I couldn't park, so I didn't stay, where they used tear gas next to the ICE facility and against children, families, etc. So there's a deep resentment in the ways ICE is intervening here. On the other hand, as, for instance, Trump announced that the National Guard would be sent from somewhere else in this country to reinforce the action. There was a meeting in church, in several churches, but particularly in one church I went to, convened by several of the ministers and saying, how shall we face what is likely to happen? And the unanimous answer from both all the ministers, priests, rabbi who were there, we shall meet them in peace. Mm. This is the answer. And I have noticed in the demonstrations that I've been to in the last 2 weeks that there are very few signs that are insulting to ICE. They say, de-ice the streets of Portland. That's not insulting. It's just a way, using humor, to say, we don't want you here. And same thing in the slogans that are hurled across, few insulting. There are always some exceptions, but few insulting, because for me, the non-violent means are as important as the ends. If we, especially with what we know of the ICE recruitment, if you just give them a reason to turn violent, they will. So I think the citizens have tried to hold their own and say, let's meet them with love and peace rather than insults.
No, I was going to say what I remember from Portland was just that they added that layer of humor and creativity to the demonstrations with the costumes and, making it more appealing to people. Yes. I think they did a great job on that. And LA and Chicago also added their own layers of what their protests were going to look like. I think we've all learned from each other. And I think Minneapolis has developed what they call the Minneapolis Model. So if other cities need, the lessons that we've learned, we're more than willing to share all that. And your remarks, John, about where ICE is going to go next and where it's been hitting, it's a visual, but it's a map. There's two maps. One is a map of the U.S. that outlines where the ICE activity has been. And then the second map shows the blue states and the red states. And guess what? They align perfectly. So there's that. And just one other thing I wanted to add, just in terms of the more historical look at immigration, and that is that I think there's always been this sense of two versions of looking at immigrants. One is quite positive, where people feel like they give economic dynamism, entrepreneurship, that helps labor contributions. They fulfill essential roles. In rural areas, the schools have stayed open because of the increased tax base. And people feel really a basic humanitarian responsibility, kind of a moral obligation too. And they see cultural diversity as an enrichment. I know the League of Women Voters, I've gone to some citizenship sessions with them, and you have to bring your Kleenex because it's such a touching experience to see people get that far and finally are done with that road, versus people who are just their value system turns them that they value safety, maybe more border controls. They get fearful when there's too much change, and they fear competition, as you mentioned, Johns, and public resources, and that they strain, the welfare systems and strain our schools. So there is very divergent ways of looking at that. And I think Minnesota stands more with the former.
And what touched me in what I saw from the demonstrations and what the stories is that the real sense of community, of solidarity, as you mentioned, among people, that people are going out of their way to help people who we feel directly threatened to go to school or to commute, etc. So that's wonderful. And I wonder whether this might be actually specific to Minneapolis Sample, where there are, I trace it to the Scandinavian origin of a number of people in Minneapolis Sample who have a real sense of community and solidarity.
I'm really, really, really proud of the Twin Cities because the Eastern responded to fear, anger, and grief with courage, creativity, and care. They organized around a bottom-up approach, less organized and more organic, yet they remained really disciplined and focused. Journalists predict that future historians and political scientists will study and model how all the Minnesotans outsmarted and discombobulated federal agents. So that's what gives me hope that Minnesotans on the side of recognizing that society welcomes the stranger. And there were so many helpers, so many points of connection that were made. People became First Amendment enthusiasts. People showed up to join with others to bear witness simply. But there also was 30,000 people plus in Minnesota signed up for the trainings, for observer and upstander trainings. They learned how to document without interfering, how to stay steady under stress, how to protect constitutional rights. And they also added that to know your rights and nonviolent training. They use the encrypted app Signal in WhatsApp, chats, whistles, observer surveillance kits so that they could track ICE convoys in real time and shared verified information. So there was just a lot of that going on, many, many examples of the schools started focusing more on delivering food, providing emotional support, because they had parents who were having to share with their kids what they would do if mom or dad were gone and who they would go with and prepare at as much as they could for that entity. There were also people who were being trained who were schooled that if they were stopped by ICE, that they were, and these are people who were delivering groceries to people who were just trapped in their homes for literally months, that they were to eat the piece of paper that the addresses were on so that there wouldn't be any negative consequences of finding out where other people live. So yeah, it's been quite a journey, but I think that we can be so proud of how our community has reacted.
We've all been watching that. Now, we only have about 10 minutes left. Let's turn to where do we go from here. I want to talk about two issues. One is something I call the mandate problem. This is actually, I think, a problem in America, period. America is almost equally divided on a whole set of issues right now. Guns, the role of government and taxes, climate versus oil, and on it goes. And the interesting thing is each party, when they get elected, act like they have an 80-20 mandate, when in fact, every presidential election and every congressional election in the last 26 years, in this century, has been by a very narrow margin, come down to a very few votes and a very few seats. And the interesting thing is each party, when they take over, act like they have this huge mandate, and which is kind of what the Trump administration is doing now. But I want to just talk about that we've only made two real attempts to deal with immigration in America in the last 40 years. And it's probably good to ground it a little bit and then talk about where do we go from here. In 1986, Congress actually passed the last major immigration reform act called the IRCA Act in 1986. It did three things. It legalized millions of undocumented Americans. It penalized employers who hired undocumented workers, and it increased border enforcement. It was a great compromise, and is the last time we passed an immigration reform in America was 1986. Get your head around that. That's like almost 50 years ago, a half a century ago. We haven't even tried to do it since 2006, when Senate Bill 2611, the Grand Compromise, introduced by John McCain and Edward Kennedy. Maybe you remember those two guys, Ted Kennedy and John McCain. Talk about some icons of each of their parties. It had Senate success. It passed with 62-36 votes, including support from 23 Republicans. And it had some important key provisions, which sounded an awful lot like the ones we have now. been suggesting, which is a path to citizenship for people who've been here, but border enforcement, et cetera. And then it failed because the right wing of the Republican Party harpooned it in the House of Representatives, and it hasn't seen the light of day since. And maybe each of us can weigh in a bit. My view is it's time for the American people to ask both parties to come together and solve this. Van Jones, who I respect a lot, a CNN commentator, said something about a year ago that I cannot forget. You know how sometimes someone says something you can't unforget? He said, the sad thing is, he said, neither party wants to solve the immigration issue now because then they couldn't run against each other on it. And it told me one of the real issues in American democracy in this two-party system is, especially when it's so competitive. Ezra Klein, in his book, Why We're So Divided, Why We're So Polarized, said that the fact that each election is so close now actually makes for less compromise because each party thinks we may win the next one and take charge. So the fact that it's so competitive, you think competition is good, it would make us compromise more. But the more competitive and 50-50 the country has become politically, the more the parties have no incentive to work with each other. Now, we can argue about which party is more to blame. I have my own view, but I won't weigh in. But the point is, it's time for the American people to demand comprehensive immigration reform that aligns with what most Americans want. Because until we do that, this is not going to stop. And the second thing, until we deal with our own dark history, which started with slavery and happened with the people like my grandparents who came here from Italy and people who came from Asia, what we did to the Japanese immigrants during World War II, we have a dark history, never mind how we treated the indigenous people and still do. So we got to look in the mirror and realize we got a problem with the outsider. But we also have a big heart in this country. We've welcomed in millions and millions of immigrants. And I just think the people are going to have to rise up and demand some common sense here. I don't see it coming, but I'd love to know what either one of you think before we bring this to a close. I want that desperately, but I don't see it coming. I feel like it's just so far from happening now, but I'm hopeful this situation will galvanize for Americans that whatever we do, we've got to come together and figure something out. I wonder what each of you think. Kathryn, I'll start with you. Be brief, both of you, because we have only a few minutes. Kathryn, your thoughts on that, and then Alain.
Well, one sentence that I really like, and I totally agree with what you're saying, John, wouldn't it be nice if we could just all kumbaya together over this border issue and make a better country? There's no doubt about it, because we do need immigrants. I think that that's the bottom line, and we welcome them. We have a long history. But the sentence is, immigration is not a crisis to eliminate. It's a force to manage wisely. Mm-hmm. And I think that your thoughts about what we need, some of the things that I came up with was to tell the economic truth, that it's needed in healthcare and agriculture, meat processing, construction, all of those industries, and to replace this fear-based enforcement, which is going out now, with the rule of law stability, to make sure that we're not going totally in terms of deferment, but more rule of law. And then, as this is mentioned before, but to create predictable legal pathways that people can count on and not have to worry that things are going to change and you can't trust people. To recognize local success that has happened. I know in Minnesota, we've invested in language programs, refugee resettlement programs, community-based integrations. And I think that it's driven by climate displacement, political instability, and economic inequality. So given all of that, I think it's only going to get worse. So I think it would just be brilliant if we could get our arms around that.
Thank you, Kathryn, for being with us today. We really appreciate it. And Alain, over to you, and then I'll close.
Yeah, it sense from a systems thinking perspective, and sometimes we have to go through worse before better behavior. And we are getting through worse behavior now. Is this a condition for one, people becoming, especially people who are sort of undecided, to say, no, we don't want that. We cannot continue like this. This is too painful, causes so much harm. And also an opportunity for younger politicians to come to the fore, like the mayor of New York, as an example of new energy in both parties, possibly, that would make it a more common issue to solve. And yes, overcome the very dark history that we have as a country. And France, as most colonial countries, has a very dark history to overcome as well. The move from fear to love, if I may say so, or as some of my friends call it, relational energy. We need to invoke that more and more, that people have that need for themselves, for their children, their grandchildren. And I hope this will be, it's fairly general what I'm saying, but I hope that this becomes more of a living force within this country that is expressed in practical terms.
Thank you, Alain. Well, let me just close out with some thoughts. Immigration has always been one of the defining questions of the American story: who belongs, who gets to come in, how we balance compassion with security, identity with change. What we heard today from Minneapolis is a reminder that immigration is not an abstract policy debate. It's a human one. It's about families and neighborhoods and the fabric of our communities. History shows that America moves forward when we resist the temptation to oversimplify, when we acknowledge that our politics are divided, that no party has a sweeping mandate, and that real solutions require humanity, listening, and a willingness to see one another fully. The way forward is not fear or slogans. It's not pretending we have easy answers. The way forward is a conversation, honest, grounded, and compassionate. And it's very important not only for us to remember that dark history, but to remember that so many of us, including myself, were once upon a time seen as a danger to American culture. But we actually became an important part of American culture. And that's the story of America. Underneath all the racism, underneath all of the challenges around immigration, we are, in fact, a country of immigrants from many places who together build something very beautiful. And the question we must leave ourselves with is this: what kind of country do we want to be? And what's the conversation that we need to have that will help us get there? We want to thank you, our listeners, and we'll see you next time on The Way Forward.